The camera flashes, the crowd cheers. But behind Amber Rose's fierce walk down the street in fishnet and defiance was a story much deeper than glamour. A story not about fame or fashion, but about a woman who had been shamed, ridiculed, and silenced for too long. And when she finally screamed back through a movement the world didn't expect, it wasn't just for herself. It was for every woman who had been called a name just for being herself. Long before the 2015 SlutWalk made headlines across the world, Amber Rose had already been made into a cultural spectacle, not because of her talent or her intellect, but because of her relationships, her body, and her past. The world had watched her with a mixture of fascination and judgment, labeling her for being confident, bold, and unapologetically sexual. She had dated famous rappers, posed for photo shoots, and owned her identity in a way society often said women shouldn't. And for that, she was mocked, called names, disrespected in lyrics, humiliated on talk shows. But what the world didn't see was the quiet pain behind the confident poses, the trauma behind the style, the battle behind the brand. Amber Rose wasn't born into fame. She came from a working-class background in South Philadelphia. Raised by a single mother, she started working young first at strip clubs, not out of rebellion, but necessity. It was a path shaped by survival, not luxury. But once she entered the spotlight, especially through her high-profile relationship with Kanye West, the media erased that context. They saw her only as a symbol, not a person, a walking headline, a video vixen, a stripper turned celebrity. The industry, especially hip-hop, branded her with terms that didn't describe her character but reduced her to stereotypes. Yet what most people missed was her intelligence, her resilience, her deep understanding of how women, especially black women, especially curvy women, especially former sex workers, were often boxed into silence. For years, she held it in. She posed for photos even as online trolls tore her apart. She was told over and over that she should have known better, that if she wore certain things or posted certain pictures, she deserved whatever hate came her way. But in 2015, Amber decided she was done staying quiet. The idea started small. What if she could reclaim the word that had followed her for years? What if she could create a space where other women like her, unapologetic, misunderstood, and misrepresented, could walk together in pride, not shame? That's how the Amber Rose SlutWalk was born. It wasn't easy. When she first announced it, the backlash was immediate. Critics called it vulgar, useless, attention-seeking. Conservative pundits mocked her on TV. Even some women questioned her intentions. But Amber stood her ground. The very fact that the word slut caused such outrage was proof, she said, that the conversation needed to happen. She wasn't telling women to be promiscuous. She was telling the world to stop policing their bodies, their pasts, and their clothes. The first SlutWalk took place in Los Angeles and drew thousands of people survivors of abuse. Former dancers, college students, mothers, queer activists, people of all backgrounds walked beside Amber, holding signs that said, "My body is not your business," and "No means no even in heels." The energy was raw, real, unfiltered. Amber herself stood on stage and gave a speech that left many in tears. She spoke about being slut-shamed by men she had loved, about being torn apart by the media, about how much it hurt to pretend she wasn't affected, when deep down she was. She cried as she spoke, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Amber's SlutWalk was more than just a march. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. I'm not your stereotype. I'm not your insult. I am a person and I have the right to exist on my terms. Even those who didn't agree with every part of her movement had to admit. She had changed the conversation. She had turned pain into power. The day after the SlutWalk, headlines swirled across the internet. Some praised her courage, others questioned her motives. But Amber didn't flinch. She had expected the backlash. She had lived it her entire life. What mattered now was that women were talking about shame, survival, and the power to reclaim their narratives. What she had sparked wasn't just a walk down a street. It was a storm in a culture that had ignored the quiet suffering of women for too long. Amber knew exactly where the wound was, deepest in the lyrics and the jokes. In the way men in the music industry, especially hip-hop, spoke about women like her, she had heard it all before. She's for the streets. she's used. She doesn't deserve respect. Words dropped in songs like throwaway lines, but each one cut deeper than the last. And she had watched, helpless, as her name became a punchline for men she once loved. But now she was fighting back with facts, with feminism, and with fearlessness. Amber called out the double standards head-on. She pointed out how male artists were applauded for sleeping around while women were vilified. She reminded the world that embracing your sexuality wasn't an invitation for disrespect. Her words hit like thunder because they weren't polished. They were personal. Still, not everyone in the industry was ready to listen. Some mocked her activism as a PR stunt. Others dismissed her as just another ex-girlfriend with a mic. But Amber didn't need their validation. She had found her voice, and it was louder than their opinions. Social media became her battleground. With each tweet and Instagram post, she dismantled narratives that had boxed women in for decades. She challenged rappers. She corrected fans. She even hosted interviews where she asked the tough questions, herself flipping the spotlight onto the very culture that had silenced her. Her followers grew, so did her critics. But more importantly, so did the movement. Amber wasn't just marching for herself anymore. She was marching for the dancers still hiding her job from her family, for the teenagers shamed in her school hallway, the survivor afraid to speak because someone might ask what she was wearing. She was marching for every woman told she was too much, too loud, too curvy, too sexual, too bold. Amber told them they weren't to anything, they were enough, exactly as they were. Her campaign wasn't perfect. No movement is. Some argued it lacked intersectionality. Others felt it didn't fully address the violence faced by transgender women or women of color in low-income communities. Amber listened. She opened up the stage, invited more voices in. She knew the fight was bigger than her, and she wanted the SlutWalk to reflect that. To be a space where everyone's story mattered, not just hers. Over time, people who once dismissed her started to pay attention. Universities invited her to speak. Activists who had never engaged with pop culture began using her story in lectures. Even media outlets that once ridiculed her began asking real questions about misogyny and power. Amber had shifted the lens. She wasn't a symbol anymore. She was a force. Behind the scenes, though, the weight of it all was exhausting. The threats, the insults. The nights when she scrolled through hateful comments and felt like maybe none of it was worth it. But then she'd get a message from a girl who said the SlutWalk saved her life, who said she didn't feel dirty anymore, who said she finally believed she wasn't alone. And that, Amber said, was all the fuel she needed to keep going. She turned her pain into purpose, her shame into strength, her past into a platform. But the most powerful thing Amber Rose did wasn't shouting back at her critics. It was standing tall when the world wanted her to shrink. And as the years moved on, that voice, bold, tearful, fearless, kept echoing in the hearts of women who needed to be reminded that they too could walk through fire and lead.